I'd like to begin by acknowledging the ancient and continuing owners of the land from which I'm coming today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. For countless generations, the Gadigal cared for their country, which is the land on which the city of Sydney now stands. When British invaders arrived in 1788, the Gadigal did not cede their country to the British Crown, and like all the other First Peoples of this continent, they have never done so. This is Aboriginal land and will always remain so. Please join me in acknowledging the elders of the country where you are, past, present, and emerging. I'm Ken McLeod, your host throughout this series. Our four roundtable guests are Nora Bateson, Amanda Tattersall, Sam Rye, and Tyson Yunkaporta. And tonight's discussion is going to be opened by Amanda.
Saying that, tonight I want to set up like a heterodox understanding of power. And I just want to put it out there right now, for everyone who's listening, all the attendees. Yes, I said the word power, and I know that all of you in different ways are lighting up with different kinds of emotional responses and different thoughts. And what I want to do is invite you to take, say, a standard reaction you have to the idea of power, you know, a familiar rehearsed retort or a hot take, or even your fears around power, and just hold them gently. Because I want to take you on a little bit of a journey to explain an approach that I learned about power that I think could be quite, well, I hope that can be quite helpful and interesting, but also it's not very well known. So I'm going to explain it. So just to explain how different, how it sits differently, you know, most theories of power come from the perspective of the power holder. They make sense of the world from the perspective of the powerful. They ask who is doing what to whom, you know, and some take this idea of trying to understand who is being threatened or moved by power really far, and measuring sticks are brought out and things are quantified as though that is possible with such a complex term like power. You know, and sometimes that analysis can be really powerful. Like, I'm not here to say that approach is not completely unpowerful. And Stephen Lukes, who wrote The Three Dimensions of Power, wrote a great book on how different ways in which the powerful exercise power. But let me just put out there, this is nothing like what I want to talk about tonight, okay? So, you know, the obvious question is, so what is this mysterious approach to power that Amanda is talking about, and why is it useful? So to explain just a piece of that before we get into a discussion, you kind of need to know a little bit about me. So I'm a community organizer, and I'll explain a little bit about what that means as I explain myself. So while I work at the University of Sydney at the moment, and I do research, and I'm doing a postdoctoral fellowship, most of my life has actually been as a practitioner of social change. And when I have done different forms of campaigning or trying to make the world a better place, I haven't really done it the easy way. And frankly, I've lost far more battles than I've won. I even came into social change in a sort of, you know, heterodox kind of way, which is that I got involved in the student movement, yes, on the surface, because my dad was passionate about university education, because he only went to university because it was free, and he went when I was a child, and it meant that he went from basically a copy boy in an insurance company to upper management in an insurance company because he had that university degree. Like, sure, I got involved in the student movement because of that, but actually I got involved because I had recovered from a massive mental health crisis when I was 19, and I wanted to make sure my life had meaning following that experience. And the student movement was the place for me to find that meaning. And since that time, I've been involved in social change. Even as a university academic, I spend lots of my time involved in thinking about how the world can and should be better, not just writing about the world. And look, social change is really hard. Everyone who has tried to make things different will know how hard it is, and people can have a perspective. Obviously, lots of reasons why that is hard. This world right now thinking about how to make the world better is really hard as it sort of cascades into worseness, right? You know, we look to the United States to see some of the worseness that is around. So when I was involved in social change, I always tried to push the envelope because I didn't feel satisfied that the tools that people were using were effective enough. I went to rallies. I helped organize one of the largest rallies in Australia's history against the war in Iraq, but we lost. And I was like, well, that's not enough. What do we do next? I looked at coalitions and I wrote a book on coalitions to try and work out how to do that better, and then built new and different things all the way through to try and work out how we could make change better. I didn't like how we didn't use digital tools enough. I helped set up GetUp, lots of different things to try and make things better. But the thing that was most impactful on me was discovering community organizing. And community organizing is a focus on making change based on an understanding of relationships and an understanding of power. And it was an extraordinary experience. I went to the United States. I trained in the approach to community organizing is not easily found in books. You won't often find it in journal articles. It's basically an oral tradition. While it is written up by some, it's basically an oral tradition. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people have attended in the United States, 10-day training, in Australia, 6-day training and 2-day training. And it's through those conversations, those sort of Socratic sort of conversations, that this method of how to interact in the world is transmitted. And I did those things. So I did the training overseas, and then I put some of those ideas in my backpack on the way home, and I brought them to Australia, and we had to translate them to an Australian context. And we started the Sydney Alliance, which was based on those traditions. And look, I could talk endlessly about lots of different parts of community organizing. I'm only going to talk about one, which is this idea of power. So I am wondering, and if people might want to note it in the chat, who felt uncomfortable when I said the word power. I wish I could see people's faces, but in this tool, I can't see anyone. So who knows? Maybe you're going, oh, yes, I did, or no, I didn't. But if you had something to say, you could note it in the chat. I raise it because whenever I would work in the Sydney Alliance and I would run a training, more than half of the people, particularly from the religious community, would say, I don't feel very comfortable with the idea of power. And there's a reason. It's okay. So there's heaps of people in the chat who aren't finding it difficult, and we are grateful that they are. And I imagine that they feel more confident in saying it in the chat, right? But there's plenty of people who, the silent majority, no, just kidding. But the forgotten people, no. But there is a constituency of people who are uncomfortable with the idea of power. And why? Because people who use power badly do horrendous things to us across history, horrendous things. Power can be abusive, power can be domination, power can be totalitarian, power can be abuse. We have the famous quote, Lord Acton, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Like, we have the most negative perception of power, even though that actual quote, when it was said, was power has a tendency to corrupt and power corrupts absolutely. We have imbued it as just negative, negative, negative. But actually, when you look in the dictionary, power is defined as the ability to act, full stop, the ability to act. It's neutral. Martin Luther King Jr. was at pains to teach his people that power was neutral, and it was actually important for African-American communities to create power to make change. So instead of seeing power always as negative, community organizing tries to understand two sort of archetypal types of power, so people can see both its negative features and its potential for positive features. And so we contrast the idea of power over and power with. So power over is what people shuddered at when I said the word power. Domination, control. It's the kind of relationship where one person basically has all the authority and control and makes the other person subject to it. It's the kind of behavior that can happen interpersonally, and it can happen society-wide. It's a scalable and kind of toxic form of power. But power with is a far more magical idea. It's centered in relationships. It's by its very nature a relational idea, and it's where where relationships are open, genuine, deep, trusting between people who are different, not always easy. Power with is not about having, kumbaya. Sometimes it's difficult, hard conversations, but powerful nonetheless, trusting nonetheless, where people can come together to care for each other, to learn from one another, and also to imagine and plan how to make their world more aligned with their values. So power with contrasts with power over. In a way, power with holds power in tension with the practice of love. And there's lots written about the tension and relationship between power and love. And this is a concept that holds those in tension. So as Martin Luther King said, and I want to quote, power without love is reckless and abusive. And love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love, implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power, correcting everything that stands against love. That's the kind of understanding that I want to bring to a discussion about power. And so why is this useful? Just in finishing, I think it's useful for a few reasons. One, it actually shows that we all have power. There is no empowerment in this group, right? We have power, and part of it is being able to understand how to build it well, or when it occurs toxically. In a fraught world where things can feel like everything's out of control, actually to remember that we have some level of agency, even though the world is contingent, is powerful. Secondly, it says our power comes from our relationships, flies in the face of sort of cliched leadership tools that say power is about aggression or status symbols or good speeches or whatever. It says power in relationships is what's most important. It also says that power is not just about changing the world as some sort of external being, but power is also about changing ourselves, that we learn and change in the process of these relationships, and that is powerful too, holding that sort of dialectic between the idea of social change and personal change. And then finally, this understanding of power warns us. Just because we're good doesn't mean because they say they're good doesn't mean that they actually are. Power is a way we can interpret people's behavior. We can judge people by their actions, by how they practice their relationships, and whether they are true to hearing each other, or whether they might talk the talk but not walk the walk when it comes to acting in a power with kind of way. They might say they're power with, but do they act more power over? So it's not just how people promote themselves in the public gaze, but these understandings of power help us to hold people accountable, to be to act more accountable to their values. So I'm going to leave it there and open it up to the panel.
Okay, so one reflection I was having whilst we were sort of thinking about this sense of power and relationships and power with and power over is I guess the wondering of, when you do get a group of people together who are using their power with to form a greater sort of mass for social change, I'm interested in, like, what is the dynamic where they then flick into power over the group of people who potentially are being affected by that change, and like, what is that dynamic about?
I'd be interested in what Tyson's thinking about this in the context of what you said in our last conversation, Tyson, about Indigenous communities separating power from authority.
Yeah, well, that's coming from my spouse Megan's work, where she's looking at IK governance systems and the blockchain and all that kind of thing, and particularly looking at the issues of trust, etc. And so she's built on Mary Graham's work. Mary Graham is really worth reading. I could flick around a paper from her where she talks specifically about that and some other really interesting related things. But yeah, so she's an elder from around Gold Coast way there. Auntie Mary, just best thinker, like gold, best thinker I've ever met. She's just amazing. Yeah, but she talks that up a lot. But yeah, there is that separation of power and authority. And and I suppose we could sum it up again, but basically you've got elders have the authority. So elders and knowledge keepers have authority, but they don't have power. Power itself is distributed throughout the community. And, you know, there's a lot of collective decision making. There's sometimes temporary hierarchies that are formed for to get particular things done. But in the end, your elders have the authority. I'm a really firm believer that, all right, so the boomers aren't going to give up their capital or their power or anything else. We've only got 2 septuagenarians to choose from to lead the free world, whatever that means at the moment. They're not going to give it up. We're going to have to wait for them to die. And when they do, I'm trying to encourage all the Gen Xers that I come across with this idea that we're going to need to take one for the team. We're going to have to effectively disinherit ourselves and make sure that it's millennials and Gen Z who are stepping into leadership positions. Because I strongly believe from an Indigenous perspective that you should not lead or exercise power unless you have you're young enough to have a feisty grandmother, because you need your grandmother there, and she needs to have veto power over anything that you're going to do. And I guess that's the difference between power and authority. But you know what? I wasn't really thinking about it when Amanda was talking and Sam was talking from an Indigenous perspective. For some reason, the Romance languages popped into my head. You know, French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, all these ones. Dalmatian, which doesn't exist anymore. I think Romanian's another one. Anyway, in all the Romance languages, you've got this thing coming down from Latin where you've got this infinitive that means to be able to. But that infinitive, if you put a definite article in front of it, then that's the noun that means power. So power, there's no real difference between the idea of power and ability in the Romance languages. And I don't think that when we think about power, like the power of the rich, the powerful, the basically the elites, that's not power what they have. Okay, so if power, like on the ground at the grassroots for all human beings in a distributed way, is about ability, like the ability to do things. The power that elites have is the ability to restrict other people's ability to do things. So their power is not just about what they can do. I mean, they could pretty much do anything they could imagine after their first million, you know what I mean? But beyond that, growing their power is really just about restricting everybody else's ability to get anything done. You know, it's what you can and can't do. And I think that's what people dislike, just about these gammon arbitrary hierarchies that are sort of crushing us all to death right now. And I could talk more later about the spirit side of that. I just feel like I've gone too long for now. But you know, the power is also energy. It's also spirit. It's also the metabolism of a living system. That's power. That's the energy that fuels all the interactions that you need to keep a system going. And you know, in our way of looking at the universe, that's a spirit, that energy. And every person holds that in their belly. That's your big power. That's your Pitan, or whatever you want to call it in your language. You might call it chi or whatever, but everyone holds that power. And then there's that big power that we're pretty much swimming in, like, I don't know, like a Tesla, you know, energy distribution system that's wireless. It's like that. We're all swimming in that all the time, in that big spirit. And we have our own individual power in our bellies there. And so, you know, we are all autonomous there, but at the same time, that power is networked, you know, in our relations with everyone and everything else, human and non-human. Yeah, so that's initial thoughts there.
I'm really careful with my use of the word power, because I find that it gets tossed around in ways that actually make it a something that's kind of untouchable, like it's its own abstraction. And that I don't think it is. When I have been in situations and witnessed situations, and certainly when we're dealing with the exploitation of, you know, most of the world's populations and all of the natural world, what I am careful to try to do is articulate in as much as I can, which is always a, you know, language is power, which is always an approximation, but to try to talk about what's happening in the relationship. And to give that articulation more than just that one parking place, because the more articulation there is in the description of the relationship that has this power thing in it, the more possibility there is, the more complexity can sneak in, the more details come in, the more threads can come loose, the more we're looking at a something that is possible to respond to and shift instead of just a thing. And so I'm careful with the terminology, because it, you know, like you said, Amanda, it triggers so much. And you know, it's no joke. This whole question is no joke. And it's centuries of death and destruction and taking, and, you know, all sorts of, and it continues. So what is it that we're talking about? And I think, you know, in a way, Tyson, I think your discussion of this notion of power as being something that is actually not the source of fire and strength within to do, but to constrict and restrict and divide and separate, and in some way devitalize a relationship, to take the life exchange, to take the possibility of generative relationship out. And in, you know, I think that, you know, last time we were talking about change, and one of the things that is at the core of that I find disturbing is where even the idea of change becomes an idea of manipulation. And some piece of that is attached to this conversation. Maybe that's how we got into this. But this idea that power as this thing, that these relationships that are destructive can be met with a particular kind of manipulation, and that we can technique that manipulation, I think is a path to more mistakes. And that, in fact, what I would love to, you know, see more of is the possibility of opening, you know, seeing the larger patterns, yes, but then opening the detail of the particular relationships, and getting in there with hands-on, in ways that are particular to the situation. So I think I'll stop there with just kind of the plug for being careful to talk about what's actually in the relationship as much as you can. And that language is, of course, fallible.
Just a few thoughts. I actually want to start with something Nora said, and then I want to turn to Sam's provocation around this pattern of power over and power with inside of spaces and how that transition occurs. So I'm going to assume that there'll be some of people on the line who've had lots of experience in social movements or social change organisations, and maybe some who've had less. But for those who are not familiar with it, there's heaps of training programs, right? The one that I was part of, the Sydney Alliance, is just one, you know, like lots and lots and lots of training programs. And I think what is interesting is predominantly there are two ways in which the world is explained and how to act is explored with people wanting to make change. on one hand, people have skills-based training, and on the other hand, people have knowledge-based training. Now, I find skill, I mean, look, we all need skills in life, and, you know, to be helped to learn how to practice a conversation, or, you know, like they're doing in the US at the moment, where they're doing get out the vote conversations on Zoom and with text message, right? That's a skill, and I'm glad that they have it, because it's hopefully going to deliver a positive result. But skills are really limited, because for what Nora said, they provide only a formalistic way of understanding how to relate to other people. They say if you tick this box and this box and this box, then you achieve an outcome. And that outcome can be a relationship or a piece of change. And for that reason, I think that they're quite dangerous. Even the word power is used in that world. People talk about power analysis. So anyone who's familiar with having developed a campaign strategy would know what power analysis is, which is where you map out someone who has power and all the other people who influence them to try and move their power. It's a very formulaic way of looking at how to win change, right? Usefully, when we worked at the Sydney Alliance, which was a form of change based on community organising, built in the tradition of the Industrial Areas Foundation. Saul Alinsky wrote the sort of original books around that, and there's a whole tradition in that. I'll put a few links for people in the chat, just if you're interested. I can see there's some comments there, just to sort of understand what it is. It prides itself on teaching knowledge. And I remember when I first did the training, I was like, oh, I'm being given a few concepts, and then I'm able to interpret my sort of life's experience in making change and failing to make change according to these concepts. The concepts are like a lens back on my practice, right? And I found that very useful. And I think, you know, that's what I'm trying to explain is possible with a power over power with understanding. That is not often, that's not often how the word power is used, but I think I wouldn't write it off. Like, I actually find that there is something very rich in this space. I think that the Romantic languages and the Romantic tradition was right in identifying it's this question of agency. I do think that that's important. And I've lost my train of thought. Oh, and the reason why it's useful is because of Sam's question, right? So social movements and social community organizations run around the world with a little bit of self-righteousness sometimes, pretending to be perfect and being imperfect, right, at the same time. Whereas this tool, rather than going, it's not normative, it doesn't describe what you ought to do, it's saying, what are your actions and how do we measure your exercise of power according to what you actually do? And, you know, as Sam said, in relation to social movements that say that take power in a national context and turn dark, there's those examples. I mean, there are calm little social movements that do that all the time. I mean, even really loose social movements that look beautiful, like, and no denigration of them, but like the Occupy movement, which looks beautiful. But, you know, it only really works to be beautiful if you've got a spare 60 hours for a meeting. Like, don't be a mum with young kids or something, because the only way they make decisions is by extended consensus. That's pretty tricky. It was called the tyranny of structuralness by feminists in the late 60s and early 70s. And, you know, is that power with, or is that power over? You know, so these two concepts can be used to really get into the nitty-gritty of how the relationships are being practiced in a space, to help you evaluate when a thing's moving in the right or the wrong direction. It's not, I don't think it's not normative. It's not like, oh, you've crossed the line and now you're evil. It's not just evil dictators who practice power over. It's actually something we all have a tendency towards, and we have to set up strategies and structures that guard against that. I think that makes it's much more interesting, but therefore important to talk about, because I sort of feel like it is a real world thing that happens to movements. And if we don't have labels, usefully used, lightly held conceptual tools, then people sometimes don't know how to interpret what they're experiencing.
Sam, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, it makes me think a little bit about sorry, my kids are screaming in the background, so it's hard to think. I guess where I was sort of leading was a little bit towards the like when movements turn dark, but also just I guess the question of who decides what change we should be heading towards, like who is that decided by, and how is it negotiated or not negotiated? So when I say the groups that are developing their sense of power with, and community organizing, and they've got their sense of justice, but for another person that might feel like oppression. And so while I know where I sit, I know that maybe my behavior may feel like oppression to someone else. Certainly feeling that with my kids sometimes at the moment. So yeah, so I'm interested in that. And I guess the work that I've done, and I guess particularly in the context of this conversation of Anthropocene transitions, I'm particularly interested in that because of this sense of, well, to some extent, you have to have a voice, or you have to be able to participate in the negotiation to exercise your power and adjust that. I guess express, what is the love that we share and that we're heading towards. So I'm interested in the sense of the Anthropocene transition, like where is the voice for the animals, for the other forms of life, and how do we do social change holding those sorts of aspects within our grasp, when there is, short of our country being on fire, which is a great way to for Mother Nature to remind us that it's around. How are we taking into account the relationships we have with the land, with the trees, with the species that live in it? I'm not sure if that's too abstract, but it sounds like Nora's going to follow up, so that's good.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that, Sam, because I feel like there's another piece here, which is just, I think, an extreme frustration and a danger of a loss of morale, of feeling like, what's the point? And the what's the point thing is that, we're watching rapists get put in the Supreme Court. We're, what's the point? And how is that happening? How is it that I know that if somebody that I'm in relationship with, in a professional relationship with, if that person crosses a line and makes any kind of a physical or even an ideological violation of my personness, that I really, it's not worth it to try to sort it out. Like, why didn't anyone tell about Harvey Weinstein? Why, like, the problem is that the thing is held in the context. The oppression is in the relational gray matter of the society. And it's very difficult to get it and to deal with it, because it's kind of like everywhere you look for it, it escapes. Because is it that person's fault that they, whatever it is, or were they in a context in which that was how you exemplified your personal strength? And so where is it? And so I think this is, I don't know, there was a moment when we were all getting ready for these sessions, and Tyson joked and said, yeah, but we can be like Charlie's Angels and Ken can be Charlie. And what I love about that is the imagination and the mythology and the humor and the kind of, ironic reference to culture, because we need that. We need ironic reference to the culture in which these invisible threads are binding us. And so, yeah, I mean, there's the bad guys are winning. And that's kind of what I want to say, is that somehow that's really in the center of this conversation for me, is there's a story. Yeah.
I'm going to have to follow this, some of this mood that's coming out there from that. What Nora said was a bit of a chemical reaction coming out from that with people, I think, in particular around that violence and sexual violence. So, yeah, I think that's a good spot. I mean, anyone who's read my work would know that I have a really particular personal idea of what power is and how it's distributed. For me, I think power is related to violence and the affordances of violence and who has access to it. And I've argued very strongly that civilizations are basically monopolies on violence. Like they created these elites that have a monopoly on violence. And once you do that, you do terrible things. But then also, I mean, you've got to throw a dog a bone too. So they set up these patriarchies, you know, whereby one half of the peasantry gets to have a monopoly of violence on the other half of the peasantry. And so we get that that male against female violence. I don't know, see, my reaction when Nora was talking is I had a flashback to my mum Ersie, who she used to say whenever this topic came up, and people would ask her, you know, what she thought about, or if she was worried about violence, like male violence or, you know, sexual or otherwise. And she used to always just shrug and say, I'll just squeeze him ball. Like, she has some strong, she was a tiny woman, but she had some strong fingers. And, you know, she busted up a gonad or two in a time. She did a lot of weaving and string making and digging and grinding. So she had like, her fingers were like a vice. Yeah. So I don't know. I just, I think you can't really talk about power in the way that we're talking about it without talking about violence. And you need to reconcile yourself with the uncomfortable fact that redistribution of power also means a redistribution of violence. And I think in any healthy system, you know, violence must be distributed throughout that system. Is that, you know, most of the beings in that system need to be able to have some competence in violence and have access to the tools and affordances of violence. And that's a very uncomfortable thing for people to face, because everybody's got these no place utopias, these ideas in their head of a peaceful settlement. But a peaceful settlement is a mythology that's never ever existed. It never will exist. You're not, if you have peace, you have no creation. You know, creation is violent. Violence is part of the pattern of creation. And there is something wonderful in the agency of violence when that's distributed, because it does very minimal harm when it's distributed throughout a population. It becomes ritualized, it becomes transparent, it becomes highly rule governed, and it works. It's when you get these little monopolies of violence, these little stockpiles and surpluses, that it's no good. And particularly if you elevate one gender over another and give that gender a monopoly on violence, and you raise one gender to be raised in this confinement of their bodies in these shitty restrictive clothes that we give to girls, and you know, just restrict them and restrict them until they can't even punch or throw. They're doing this. I don't know what this is, but you know, you go to any Indigenous community where women aren't raised like that, and women do not throw like that. Women do not hit like that. This confined, restrained thing. You know, that's a thing of civilization. And you see that from Asia to the Middle East to England, everywhere. Women who are raised in confinement have no facility with violence. And then men are overtrained to have, you know, a ridiculous, you know, excessive facility with violence. Yeah, and it's, I know it's uncomfortable, it makes everybody uncomfortable, but I think we need to sort that out first. I think violence needs to be distributed, between genders a little bit better, and we all need to get a little bit comfortable with having a bit of a punch on from time to time. All human beings, in controlled circumstances, and and that's kind of a little bit what peace actually looks like. And I know nobody wants that, because people want that sanitized civilization where the violence is outsourced to other people, other places where we extract our materials from. It's outsourced to the communities that are zoned out on the fringes of our of shitty real estate. They're taking the blows for everybody else to live in their little techno utopias, where nobody ever has to see anyone get punched in the nose. Yeah. There's no solutions in that. I'm throwing it out there that it's messy, and it's something to face, I believe. And I don't know. I kind of wanted to go into that and try and give some kind of sense of agency or comfort, or to people that I know were really triggered. There's one girl in particular in there, I felt like she was she went back in, revisited trauma and all that kind of thing. And I don't know, I just wanted to reach out to her, I guess, when I started talking, and then I started rambling instead. It's that narcissism, see? Get monologuing, that's start mansplaining power, and off we go. But look, yeah, I just want to reach out to her and say, hang in there, eh? And suggest to you that trauma is not something that happens at the point of impact. The trauma is what happens in the space in between the impact and you making meaning of the impact. And lifelong trauma is the result of failing to make meaning of what happened. And yeah, and that stuff happens.
I think that I'm so glad you said that, Tyson, because, and I was just talking to Bhavana in the chat too, to clarify a little bit that what we're talking about is ideas of strength that exist in the context that get illustrated through the violence. But this is, we're talking about a premise in a societal set of mythologies and ideologies that are based on taking. It's based on what's in it for me and a predatory behavioral, that's the base. So of course, that context is going to manifest and generate predatory behavior. And then we're in it. And then we want a justice system that's going to be able to correct it. But it seems to me that there's a deep ideological, epistemological issue at the core. And I think this notion that you're bringing in of distributed violence is a really interesting question of what changes a societal basis and what that feels like. So I was just reading a thread this morning. And, I live in Sweden, but I'm from the States. And if you talk about socialism in the United States, it's like, you're talking about incarcerating the entire population or something. It's a trigger word. And yet, who pays the police? Who pays for the schools? Who builds the roads? Who deals with the bridges? Where does that money come from? Taxes, right? So it's always been a bit of a question to me, where that's coming from. But what is the shift into a way of working together where that possibility for life is generated between us instead of degenerated? That is just that we learn, okay, generations in, we were all learning how to be in this world. And, my mama said to me, if you don't learn to iron a man's shirt, you can't you. And at that moment, I decided I would never iron anything ever. But I'm just saying deeply, this is deep stuff. It's deeply learned. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I just, violence distributed is not such a bad thing. In fact, it's a really good thing. And I don't think that you can have a healthy system without it. You know, I don't think you can be a healthy person unless you're challenged with violence. And if you're looking at evolutionary dynamics within a system, there needs to be a certain amount of violence, you know, in order to maintain any kind of fitness. You know, if you're into that Darwinian side of things, it's hard to deny that. You need to know where your edges are, you know. And I mean, I've raised, I don't know, about 12 different kids, every single one of them, boys and girls. You know, I grew them up the same way, and I did teach them how to fight. And I taught them how to do knife fighting and throw knives and throw spears and fight with sticks and fight with rocks and fight with their hands, with their feet, teeth, everything, you know. And they're not people who've ever been harmed in a fight. You know, or done particular harm to another person, but they haven't shied away from it either. And I think you need to come up against every now and then. I got beaten up by a woman 2 days ago. You know, it's just for me that it's a normal part of your life that occasionally you're going to get a flogging, and it's probably because you need it half the time. You know, it's no good if you're doing stuff like knocking people's teeth out or disfiguring them, or, you know,
Although, can I just say
sort of thing. But you do have to get knocked about a bit from time to time. And if that's not happening, then you're kind of not really alive. And you do need that energy to metabolize your system a little bit.
So I just want to come back on this case. So in the world as it is, I don't want it to sort of necessarily come straight on at your sense of distributive violence. I actually think it's curious, because I sort of feel like everything should be distributed. That's how we overcome the concentrations of power. But in the world as it is, where 98% of domestic violence is perpetrated against women, some of these ideas feel frightening. You know, I feel frightened by the idea that it's okay for everyone to be violent. You know, like, I'll be straight with you, like, it frightens me, because I don't have that. You know, I can't defend myself. I do not have the physical testosterone, going through my body that makes me, that I feel that makes me strong enough.
But you got cousins, right?
Yeah, I've got boys, man. Like, but on the serious point, right? Like, I just sort of feel like the specific concept of violence is a difficult one. But someone raised in the chat, and I think it's worth drawing out the metaphor of what we're talking about with the idea of violence, or it's just all standing up for ourselves. And it's like, you said, have I got cousins? Yeah. So the idea that you don't have to stand up for people on your own, right? It's about being together in groups, in organized relationships with each other. Also, someone else said in the chat, it's about being comfortable with a variety of, there's a bunch of more violent emotions that we shouldn't be scared of. It's not a problem for people to have anger or deep passion. That's something that we shouldn't be scared of exhibiting. We shouldn't be scared of conflict and real honest tension in our spaces, because fake friends is not a friendship, right? We want people to be able to honestly speak to each other about where things are going bad. Someone in the chat talked about sitting in the tension, right? And because I mentioned that last time, that good relationships sit in the tension of our limits and our forthcomings. And the person said, what about in relation to colonization and race relations and so forth? And I could tell stories about that, but I also feel like I have a personal story around that, which is, like I said, I had bipolar at the beginning of the conversation, and I've had to live a life embroiled in tension around how other people see me and my exquisitely beautiful but quite different brain. And that's living in tension. And so you can have fake friends with people where they pretend it doesn't matter, or they pat you on the back and they pity you a little, or you can have real conversations about when people fuck up, and then things might change. But, when we don't have these, to use the metaphor, more violent or straight up conversations with each other, then we're not really exercising what I would call power with. In denying people the honesty and truth that we need to build powerful relationships, it's almost like we're exercising a form of power over, because we're holding ourselves back from real kinds of relationships. And that's going to get us nowhere. And I actually think that is the heart of our problem, of the problematic sort of progressive movements, or whatever you want to call them, where there's a lot of fakeness and not a lot of realness.
What skills did the early suffragettes train up in? What were the skills they were training in?
I don't know.
You recall? Arson was one of them, of course, as we know. But also they were training in martial arts. So they had if you can imagine this, like, and with the big skirts, from the old days and everything. And they're all there, in these warehouses, secretly training up in jiu-jitsu and stuff like. I can't remember which martial art it was, but that's what blew me away, and I was really looking forward to seeing that in the movie when it came out. But they didn't put that in there. I don't recall it being in there, and it's like, no, that was really important, because those ladies were fighting the police, and they were fighting the police well. This is people who, they've been doing needlepoint and stuff like that, and all of a sudden they're doing this. I just believe that everybody has to have access to it. You don't have to be brilliant and be able to beat up everybody in the world, but you do have to have access to the tools of violence, or at least have a proxy. But that's what you have siblings for, and friends around you, all the time, watching each other's back. I don't know. I believe it's really important. The other thing is, you need to give it expression from time to time, even in ritualized circumstances where you're safe to fail in a kind of a combat experience. So you set it up even as just a friendly bout. You need to be having that. If you don't, you end up with Portland. What did they have? Like, heaps and heaps of political correctness and shops that sell spoons, and they had typewriters stations where people could just, make sure they could write poetry, on every street corner, and it was all lovely, and they're all being nice to each other for so long, and then and then suddenly they all just went raw, and they're burning police cars and stuff like that. I mean, you can't suppress violence for too long. If you're doing that in your community, it is going to boil up. It's going to boil up and spill over. You have to allow violence appropriate expression, because that's part of who we are as an organism, and we need to express it. And it's good to express it in healthy and creative ways, but it's very generative as well. I mean, this is why you find, a very renewed interest in martial arts now, from a lot of people who are working in creative fields, and who are working in tech and all that sort of thing. People are sort of rediscovering that kind of balance through that, and using it to help them with their thinking and make sense of the world and innovate. You find a lot of the most creative people in the world at the moment are people who are becoming competent at violence.
Sam, do you want to come into the conversation? You have been very quiet.
I'm being very quiet because there's quite a lot of noise in the house right now. So I'll leave things from my side.
Yeah, I wanted to just kind of explore in a sort of slightly parallel territory of the question that it kind of, I think, has come up in the peripheries here, and maybe it's very central, this notion of morale, which is a word that I've been kind of playing with lately, and thinking about what that means. When Amanda, when you said, yeah, but I don't have that testosterone, I don't have that response in me to respond to a situation with violence. And I want to kind of back up from there and think about even just, I've been through a terrible experience with the Swedish immigration authorities, and they actually, in their perverse wisdom, decided it would be good to give my son permission to stay in Sweden and deport my daughter. So they separated my children. And because she was, by the time they finished her application, she was over 21. And so she wasn't 21 when they started. And if you're over 21, you're no longer considered family in Sweden. So the point is this: my approach in interaction with the immigration system was lacking in a kind of morale that I would have had if I had a stream of information and possibilities and potentialities in me, but I didn't. What I had was a grouping of people around me who were in a state of absolute trust of the system. And that if I just provided the necessary information, the system would do what it needed to do, and clearly they wouldn't separate our family. And so there was a lack of morale. And this is a very privileged version of this story, but I think it, just to make it personal, and I think it's also there, it's this thing of the way that we have each of us learn to be in a system, and to be in deference to it. And I think what in central to this whole question of power is about what is the morale that actually is the opposite of hopelessness. I don't think that hope is the opposite of hopelessness. I think morale is. It's some kind of fiber of passion and strength and ability to be in the situation in another way. And that approach would have changed everything, right? I would not have accepted the emails that I got. I wouldn't have responded in the same way. My whole way of communicating with the migration officers would have been totally different if I had, from the beginning, had this different kind of morale. And I see this in notions of distribution sometimes, when people have this, like in the blockchain world, there was a reference to an article, which I haven't read, so forgive me if I cross territory there, but that in the blockchain, there's supposed to be distributed communication and the building of reputation, but that's going to be for the people who have the morale to participate, right? And most of the people who are not participating who are not in those positions in the outside world have learned through generations not to participate in that way. So how to, building this morale to me seems like a relational process that is communicational, it's cultural, it's certainly, there's something there that I think to contribute to this discussion about power.
Mm-hmm. I certainly don't want to discount the model that Amanda has suggested, because I think it has a lot of usefulness. It encourages us to not see power as some kind of mystical force that some charismatic leaders have or whatever, and it kind of looks at aspects of the dynamic. But as Amanda said, these are labels. And labels are always very provisional. And what worries me is when labels turn into a dogma. Power is a field phenomenon. And as I think this is what Nora's referring to when points to the danger of taking those categories, those labels, and kind of decontextualizing them. We need to start looking at questions. There's a few addressed to Amanda, and I think she's ready to respond to them.
There was Karen, whose experience had led her to come up with 4 concepts. So I presented 2, power over, power with. She also had in her own practice has talked about power to and power within. So power to as in the power to act, and power within is power, I guess, to transform internally. And she was wondering how those fit, how I thought that those fitted with the framework I presented. To this, I basically say, it's great, but I like my framework because it's two and they're in contrast, right? But I'm not here to tell you what to think. I think that people need to have a way to conceptualize and make clear for themselves what's going on when people act and how to act, right? And if 4 concepts floats your boat, I say, then that's perfect. And if for some, and there's a whole bunch of people in the chat will go, I think it's 3 concepts, and I think it's this, and I think it's that. And it's like, good, as long as we're thinking conceptually about this in a way that's healthy, so it's not dogmatic. I take on Ken's point. I've seen this stuff used dogmatically as well. I've seen the whole world of community organizing arguably has a little bit of dogma sliced through it, in the nicest possible way, but really. And I think hold the concepts lightly, but use them to sort of interpret your circumstance and interpret how to act. I think I just don't have any judgment on those other concepts. I just know what I found useful. I like the contrast, but go for it, I say. I actually, and someone else talked about power with and unleashing power. I think if people can conceptualize these ideas and use them and teach others in their group, then that's what we need to do. That's what we need to do. Lorna talked about what's the relationship between power and imagination? And I think this is a really interesting question. So traditionally in organizing, the Linsky, like in Rules for Radicals, he wrote about this. See how I'm treating it like a Bible? No, but people in community organizing sometimes treat these texts like Bibles. He talked about the idea that you can't imagine what you don't have the power to deliver, right? So that he's argued that by building relationships with interesting, diverse people and cultivating an appetite to act, your imagination goes wild as well. And that as a solitary alienated individual, say, you don't feel like you've got a lot of it's difficult to cultivate imagination because you don't really feel like you can make any of it happen. So one level I sort of go, oh, that's interesting. And I think there's a truth to that. I'd think about that for people. Like, I actually think that there is a relationship between feeling like you can do stuff and thinking that you can imagine ideas. I don't necessarily think that they're as closely related. I've had cool imaginative ideas without cultivating a network of power first. Like, I don't think that there's sort of A plus B equals C, but I think that there is, just something there. So I that's my sort of piece to that conversation. And then the final question was, what are some useful power practices? Which I think is a great question. And mine actually all go back to thinking about, even though power by its nature, like basically power with is a relational idea. So power practices in the first instance about how do we build the kind of relationships that we need to act, right? And so I always think that there are 2 core practices that we talk about, and I can put some links into the chat afterwards about some trainings I've done on this that are online. One is relational meetings, and the second is having an analytical understanding of power. So relational meetings are a particular way to conduct one-to-one meetings with people where you explore what's going on for someone else in a really holistic way. It's not like that sort of boring meeting that goes blah, 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 can you do this for me? It's a who are you, and where you share too. So you can't do a relational meeting without having some kind of understanding of your own motivations and stories and interests. And I think I think relational meetings are a power practice. The add-on to that is to be good at them, you really do have to have a sense of your own story and motivation. And so that's about personal work, reflection, having mentors, being in reflective conversations, writing, journal keeping, whatever works for you to be able to sort of work out what's going on inside and how you got to be here is critical. I love it. Someone's put in curiosity, right? The way you conduct it, one of the things we teach in a relational meeting is you got to work up your curiosity about other people, right? Thinking about those questions rather than dispensing with any sense of stereotype or pre-existing assumptions. But that has to be matched with, we talk about relational power. It does have to be matched with some level of understanding and analytic. And so, you know, I poo-pooed the idea of a power analysis previously. They're not totally useless. And one thing that I just think it's always important to do is, who do you need to be in relationship with to be able to move things? You don't need to be in relationship with all the strangers in your life. You don't have to have relational meetings with everyone who's on the train or on the bus, right? That wouldn't be that strategic. It might be fun / weird, but that wouldn't be that strategic. Who do you need to be in relationship with to be able to move something forward? So when we built the Sydney Alliance, it was all about diversity. We wanted to stand for Sydney, and we built the relationships like that. When I work in the university, I think about the faculties and who in the faculties I need to build a relationship with. There's a level of focus about who are the people that I need to build relationships with. I'll leave it there. But those two tools, there's countless tools, but I think those two are useful ones. And I'll put a link in about the relational meeting training.
Anybody else want to respond to any of the questions in the Q&A?
I don't know. I'm just looking at that, something about that horrible phrase that give a man a fish and he eats for a day, teach him to fish and he eats for a lifetime. I just always get wild about that. I'm just saying, like, give a man his river back for a start. Give his granny her river back, and like, just leave us alone. We know how to fish. Thanks. That's great. Yeah. Look, I think there's always a problem. I don't know. I always get annoyed when I hear people going, you know, there's too much talking. The time for talking is done. We need to act. Well, what's actually going to be done? I need to see some, you know, because all these little things that always start up, there's always people pushing from the start for like, oh, we need to get organized. We've got to take down this neoliberalism. So quick, let's get organized now. We need to have outcomes. I need to know what our outcomes are, our mission statement, our roadmap, and then we're going to have KPIs to. And I'm like, dude. That's neoliberalism. You're doing it. Stop. You know, like I always find that, you know, when the powerless organize, they always end up replicating the structures of the powerful. And I don't know why nobody's ever noticed that yet. It's the worst thing about the union movement. Sorry, but it is. They just keep replicating the same power structures that they're opposing, you know. And all I ever see is this, it's like this hand in glove thing happening. You know, you've got this resistance always seems to actually just support the system, or give the system more energy, or give it some new memes to rebrand itself as something else. And so I really like Ken's careful approach here. He's talking about creating cultures of transition, you know, for an Anthropocene transition. He's talking about creating fluid cultures that are adaptive and responsive, and in which emergence can occur. Things that are fluid enough to allow for emergence, you know, and he's been careful to keep us on that track in this team. And I think it's really worth doing. Yeah, so I'd just always, I don't know, give that caution of, you know, when we push back, make sure, you know, that if you're going to do that, that it is that jujitsu way someone else commented on in there. And it's not actually just, you know, butting heads and actually strengthening the hegemony, or even worse, like overthrowing the hegemons and then taking over and doing the same bloody thing again. It's you know, it's about trying to generate something regenerative out of its opposite, and that's where we're up to. Starting in parasitic relation, moving towards a symbiosis. It's a transitional thing. Sam, I like how Sam does it. I wish he'd talk up a bit more. You know, he just creates the digital houses and stuff like that, where we can just start moving around and doing these things. Like he's making digital soil for us to grow these things in. So I would like to hear more from him.
Okay. And sometimes not just digital. I think the you know, my reflection on the work that we did at Lifehack in New Zealand was just so rooted in in interpersonal culture. And for me, that's the root of all of the possibility of transition, is just relationship. And I know it's very much Nora's angle. And I know there's, you know, even looking at the names on the chat, I know there's a lot of people who are into that work as well. And I know obviously that's the root of the, you know, the relational meetings and the work that Amanda does. So yeah, it feels like I guess that the question of what personal and collective practices do you suggest for a wider use and development of our power is like, talk to people, you know, talk to people as humans. And I think, yeah, the sense of find the others is kind of strong in this as well. So yeah, my River wants to keep drawing, so I might leave it there for me. But
I've just I've noticed that with everybody who does things like you digitally, that's actually like organically working in this way, they find after a while they don't need it. And I guess, I mean, it's the irony of the whole peer-to-peer movement that you see after a while, like people don't want to use their machines anymore because they're actually peer-to-peer and just recovering that relationality of being human. Yeah.
When Sam says talk to people, that's precisely what we're doing here. And this is why we're doing these roundtables, so that we can explore these concepts. It seems to me that the critical thing is not this particular model or this particular approach, but we need to explore the concept of power. And when we see, I mean, one of the issues I've often had with some of the deliberative democracy stuff is that it often appears to me to lack any theory of power at all. So and this is a sweeping generalization. I know there are many exceptions to this, but it feels often as though the initiatives fail because they actually did not place the deliberative process in the context of real power relationships. And so they go nowhere. So it seems to me we all need to develop our own theory of power and to do it in a process of dialogue with others so that we challenge and extend and deepen our understanding in practice and in dialogue, in conversation. And, you know, to me, it seems that there are two things absolutely to be avoided. One is turning any theory into a dogma, and the other is the notion of one best way. There is, you know, that went out with Taylorism, that went out with Fordism. There is no one best way. And that's a kind of an agnostic approach in which we say the most important things are the questions we ask. They're more important than the answers because we can often get stuck on the answers to the point where we lose our ability to understand what's going on. Anyway.
I love that, Ken, and thank you for saying that. And I wanted to just add that sometimes there's this idea that if you have a beautiful project you want to do, that what you have to do is somehow write it up and get approval from the existing systems, the people who are in influence. You need to network your way into the existing power structures and the existing system to get some sort of permission to do this beautiful thing that is in fact life generative. And I kind of want to just add this into what you just said, that it's very, very difficult to be in that that tension of wanting to utilize the influence of the existing system to actually create significant change. And so this is an interesting, because Amanda, you were talking about relationships and what kind of relationships give strength, give morale, give power, and so there's this illusion that if you can get close enough to the core of the existing power structure, that some of it will rub off on you, you'll get the approval, and then you can go do the beautiful radical thing. And my experience again and again has been, actually, you probably have to work for free, and you probably have to do it on your own, and you're going to have to get parallel, and that the municipalities, like this came up the other day, the municipalities aren't going to do the thing that is really going to restructure those relationships, because it's not anywhere in their possibility of building those strategic plans. So just to kind of say in the question, where I feel like we're ending today in this beautiful spot of that power is actually relational. What are the relationships? How are the relationships tended? I've lived in a lot of intentional communities, and every single one of those experiences was a disaster, because people went on some kind of what they called in those days power trip. And it was a different kind of power trip than the man, but it was a power trip. And so, it all comes back to, how are we doing relationship? Which relationships? With what kind of textures, tones, feelings, approaches, directions? Yeah. Questions?
Well, we've got time for a couple more questions. If you want to have a look at what's coming up, it's with the Q&A and the chat running simultaneously. It's a bit of a multitasking challenge here, but see what you can do.
Can I just throw one other thing in about, because I think that's a really important point, right? And about who, like, you can't, relational meetings and building relationships isn't suckholing your way into the existing structures of power as though that's going to change anything, right? So it's good for us to clarify that. The other thing that I think is interesting about a power analysis is we do this, I don't think I've done it in this context. We do this thing in the Sydney, well, we do it in the Sydney Alliance, and I still do it in my teaching and work at the university, about doing like a power analysis for how society works as well. And we think about there being 3 circles, the market, the state, and civil society. Now they're porous and they're arbitrary, somewhat arbitrary little circles, but they refer to different things. The state is government and public services, the market is business, small and large, and civil society are like recognized organizations, but also informal organizations, even the family unit as part of civil society. And we say this thing that if power were held equally by all those different sectors, if they were held in tension equally, then that would be cool. Using Tyson's point, if it was evenly distributed between those 3 sectors, it'd be fine, because there is no utopia. But if someone abused their power, then there'd be 2 other sectors who could hold them to account, right? It would just be a self-correcting system. And then we put up a diagram. We go, oh, so how do these 3 sectors work at the moment? And we put up a diagram that has this sort of abyss market out of control with its hands over government, and this sort of tiny civil society, which we're pretty much in most Anglophile countries, it represents what's going on. And I do think that understanding of power, this sort of macro, how are power relations working in a sort of systemic kind of way, we do need to have that understanding as well. Now that's because it gives us a roadmap to think about, well, how do you act in this very difficult environment, and how do we interpret what's going on in the environment? And we say, well, maybe we should start with rebuilding civil society. And so there goes the work that we try and do. But I just wanted to add that, because I just think when thinking about power, we don't want to not also contextualize the broader systems that are at play. There are some systems at play, but this is not an argument, but to say, therefore, we need to spend all our time attacking government or attacking the market. It's more, we understand that system, and then we also understand our agency, our ability to act inside of it, and still our ability to act is focused first and foremost on building relationships, and these first and foremost with each other across the community.
That model that you've just presented of, the three sectors of society begs a lot of questions, and we can't explore them now. But one of the big ones, to my mind, is that those three components are embedded in a much bigger space that envelops them all, and which is now dynamically changing in a way that it hasn't for the last 10,000 years. In significant ways, we, whoever we are, set in process dynamics that are whole system dynamics, whole Earth system dynamics, and are also dynamics that work in geologic time beyond the volition of humans. So that in a sense, we're being asked to recognize the limits of our power. And it challenges a lot of our preconceptions about how we deal with the kind of challenges that we're facing, whether it's climate change, ocean acidification, pandemics, or whatever. They're all symptoms of the change of that context. So the contextual lens exists from the scale of the individual to the scale of the entire planet. And it's very important now, perhaps never more important. So can I thank our roundtable guests for another stimulating evening. Thank all our attendees. It's been great to have you online, and please join the forum on the Wednesday fortnight from today, and we'll dig into a lot of what's been talked about tonight. So thank you everyone, and go well.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. That was really great.
Yeah.
Good night to listeners.
Your guidance today, Amanda, was great conversation.
It went in all different directions. It was really interesting. Really interesting.